Change Conference, also known as COP26, was scheduled to meet in Glasgow in November 2020, only days after the US election. It would mark the 5th anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement. If Trump was to win, which at the start of the year seemed a distinct possibility, the future of the planet would hang in the balance. The pervasive sense of risk and anxiety that hung around the world economy was a remarkable reversal. Not so long before, the West's apparent triumph in the Cold War, the rise of market finance, the miracles of information technology, and the widening orbit of economic growth all together appeared to cement the capitalist economy as the all-conquering driver of modern history. In the 1990s, the answer to most political questions had seemed simple. It's the economy, stupid. As economic growth transformed the lives of billions, there was, Margaret Thatcher liked to say, no alternative. That is, there was no alternative to an order based on privatisation, light-touch regulation, and the freedom of movement of capital and goods. As recently as 2005, Britain's centrist Prime Minister Tony Blair could declare that to argue about globalisation made as much sense as arguing about whether autumn should follow summer. By 2020, both globalisation and the seasons were very much in question. The economy had morphed from being the answer to being the question. The obvious retort to "it's the economy, stupid" was whose economy, or which economy, or even what's the economy? A series of deep crises beginning in Asia in the late 1990s and moving to the Atlantic financial system in 2008, the Eurozone in 2010, and global commodity producers in 2014, had shaken confidence in market economics. All those crises had been overcome, but by government spending and central bank interventions that drove a coach and horses through firmly held precepts about small government and independent central banks. And who benefited? Whereas profits were private, losses were socialised. The crises had been brought on by speculation. The scale of the interventions necessary to stabilise them had been historic, yet the wealth of the global elite continued to expand. Who could be surprised, it was now commonplace to ask, if surging inequality led to populist disruption? What many Brexit and Trump voters wanted was their national economy back. Meanwhile, China's spectacular ascent robbed the economy of its innocence in another sense. It was no longer clear that the great gods of growth were on the side of the West. That, it turned out, disturbed an important assumption underpinning the Washington Consensus. Soon America would no longer be number one. In fact, it was increasingly clear that the gods, at least as represented by the nature goddess Gaia, were at odds with economic growth full stop. Climate change, which had once been a preoccupation of the environmental movement alone, became an emblem for a wider imbalance between nature and humanity. Talk of green deals and of the energy transitions was everywhere. And then, in January 2020, the news broke from Beijing. China was facing a full-blown epidemic of a novel coronavirus. It was, by that point, already worse than the SARS outbreak, which in 2003 had sent shivers down the spine. This was the natural blowback that environmental campaigners had long warned us about. But whereas climate change caused us to stretch our minds to a planetary scale and set a timetable in terms of decades, the virus was microscopic and all-pervasive and was moving at a pace of days and weeks. It affected not glaciers and ocean tides, but our bodies. It was carried on our breath. It would put not just individual national economies, but the world's economy in question. The virus that would by January 2020 be labelled SARS-CoV-2 was not a black swan, a radically unexpected, unlikely event. It was a grey rhino, a risk that has become so taken for granted that it is underestimated. As it emerged from the shadows, the grey rhino SARS-CoV-2 had the look about it of a catastrophe foretold. It was precisely the kind of highly contagious, flu-like infection that virologists had predicted.